So, it gives me great pleasure. We're here today at the Festival of Speed. This is our third day, and it's Speaker Saturday. We've had some fantastic speakers so far, and we've got some fantastic speakers coming up. This one's going to be really special though, because this is the history of Goodwood and the history of the Festival of Speed. To understand how this event became such an absolute phenomenon that it's grown into over the last 31 years. And it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Motorsport Historian Harry Sherrard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everybody for coming along. Great to be here at Goodwood. So let's crack on. Let's have a quick look at the Goodwood estate, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So we've got the Festival of Speed course here in front of Goodwood House. Down here we have the Revival. Obviously, in real life, the Festival of Speed and the Revival don't happen at the same weekend. Can you imagine the traffic if that happened? Obviously, you've got the airfield down here as well. We'll talk about that in a moment, how aviation came to Goodwood. Lots of farming going on. It's one of the largest organic farms in Europe. And up here we have the horse racing as well. Cricket as well, obviously, down here too. So lots of things. And it is England's premier sporting estate. So, how does the story begin? Well, the story begins actually in 1672 with King Charles II. Now, if you think the modern royal family get up to a few tricks, it's nothing compared to their ancestors. King Charles II had a few girlfriends and had a few illegitimate children. And one particular boy was born to King Charles II in that year, 1672. And this was his son. Hope you can make him out. Now, because the boy was illegitimate, he could never be king. So perhaps in compensation for that, the king gave him lots of titles. So he gave him the title the Duke of Richmond, the Earl of March, and Baron Setrington. And all of those titles are still in use today. So the current Duke is the 11th Duke, directly descended from King Charles II and from this son. All of the dukes have been called Charles, with one exception. I'll come back to that exception in a moment. But all of the dukes, the current duke also called Charles, and that again lineage dates all the way back to King Charles and his son, also called Charles. Now, as well as giving him the titles, his father obviously gave him a few bob as well, because he came down to go hunting at Goodwood, and he obviously liked the place, and he bought it. So he bought it in 1697, the first Duke of Richmond. So the estate is still in the hands of the same family 327 years later. Now, back then, of course, the magnificent Goodwood House that we know today didn't exist. The original house is here. I just point out in round the back, where the family still lives to this day. All of this here was put up by subsequent dukes, mainly in the 1800s. So this is a shortened version of my main Goodwood talk, so I'm going to have to skip a few centuries now, and we're going to jump from the first Duke all the way to the First World War. And this was the Lord March, if you like, of his generation. He was the son of the 8th Duke, and therefore destined obviously to become the 9th on the death of his father. He's also called Charles. You can see him here in his uniform. He fought in the First World War. And then, after the First World War was over, he'd been captured actually, and he spent a time in captivity with the Germans, released in the armistice in 1918, and he then fought on the side of the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. Very tragically, he was killed out in Russia, and he's buried out there. His grave is actually to this day still out in Russia. So with Charles's death, the titles and the land and everything else, the whole estate would all pass to his younger brother, Freddie. So remember I said earlier on that all of the dukes have been called Charles with one exception, so this is the exception. Freddie March, as he became known. Freddie was devastated by the death of his brother, who he absolutely adored, and he wasn't really very minded to take over the estate. Obviously, he wasn't born to be the Duke, but he did become the Duke by default and led an absolutely fascinating and accomplished life. Maybe next year, Nick, we actually do a talk just about Freddie March, because his accomplishments were incredible. He designed aircraft, he designed cars, he did absolutely amazing things. He also raced at Brooklands. We'll talk about Brooklands later on, the world's first purpose-built racetrack. He raced there very successfully actually, and he won what was called the double 12 race there. Because the local population objected to noise overnight, you couldn't run a 24-hour race like Le Mans, so you had one 12-hour race, pack up for the evening, come back in the morning, have another 12-hour race. So Freddie actually won that in 1930. But because he was the Duke and had all that responsibility, etc., his motor racing career was quite short, so he stopped racing and became a bit of a team manager. Now, this photograph, you're not really going to see that very clearly. Even at the best of days, it's quite a grainy and quite poor photograph, but it is absolutely incredible, the history that sits behind that, because this was taken in 1935. This is when his father died, and he therefore ascended to the dukedom, and to celebrate that, he had a motoring fun day, as he called it, a motoring event here at Goodwood House. Now you can't really see it very clearly, but that is actually Freddie driving up the drive just over there in front of Goodwood House. It only happened once in period, much smaller event obviously, but that was the event that 60 years later inspired his grandson to start the Festival of Speed. So we're now into the late 30s, into the 40s, and of course the Second World War is taking place now. Near here we have RAF Tangmere, which was a permanent brick-built RAF station, so the Luftwaffe had all the photographs they could possibly want of Tangmere. They knew exactly where it was. The Ministry of Defence and the Air Force said, well, we need an overflow airfield, we need a secondary airfield to back up Tangmere. And they approached Freddie March, the Duke, and they'd identified an area of land on one of his farms, the West Hampton farm, and they said, could we potentially use that as an airfield, an overflow airfield? Freddie said yes. So they tore out the hedges and they created a flat space, and that then served all the way through the Second World War. So this photograph, again, it's probably going to be slightly difficult for you to see it, but this is one of the first aerial photographs that were taken of the area that we're talking about now. Then as now, we all know about cars getting stuck in sort of slightly boggy ground around Goodwood occasionally. That happened obviously during the war as well. That hasn't changed. And what they discovered was that the fuel tankers and other vehicles that were going out to service the aircraft were getting stuck. And so over the winter of 41, 42, they decided, well, we better build a perimeter road around it. And this actually shows the perimeter road in construction. So those of you who know Goodwood, you can see the perimeter road running around here, and this is all the airfield. So if you're looking at these lines here and you're thinking, well, how could that be an airfield? All these hedges everywhere. Those lines are actually fake. They're made by tar. So all of this whole area inside was actually open, but they made these tar lines so that the Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots would think they were hedges and therefore not an airfield. And that was actually successful because RAF West Hampton was never attacked in the whole Second World War, unlike the mother station of Tangmere, which was actually bombed by the Germans severely, in fact, through the war. So that's the emergence then of the perimeter road. Just to give you another look at it, later in the war, this is 1943, these fantastic RAF Typhoons have just returned from a mission to bomb V2 launching sites in northern France. And this bit of the perimeter road here that the pilots are walking on, that would become Madgwick. Those of you who know your way around Goodwood, that bit of tar was Madgwick Corner. So how did motor racing start in Goodwood? Well, it's quite an interesting little story. So this is a quotation from squadron leader Tony Gaze, an Australian who was based there. So I had an MG, so did another pilot officer, Dickie Stewart. When the perimeter track was finished, I looked at it one morning and said, I think it's time we christened this thing. So Dickie and I got into our MGs and went batting around, anti-clockwise as it happens. Obviously we race clockwise these days. After a while we persuaded one or two other chaps to join in, and whenever there was nothing else going on, to have a race around. That's how it went. So that's how motor racing started at Goodwood, actually during the war, when these pilots weren't out on missions. So Freddie himself joined the RAF and the Ministry of Aircraft Production during the war, served in uniform. This is Freddie on the right. That's Tony Gaze, who we've just heard from a moment ago. They got together and Tony Gaze suggested to the Duke, look, you know, you've actually got this potential racetrack on your land. How about having a race there? So the Duke went down and had a look, and the place was an absolute mess. I mean, you can imagine at the end of the war, it had been very important in D-Day. You had all the debris and the detritus of war, smashed up buildings. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible mess. But Freddie could see the potential of the track and said, let's go for it. So the estate staff got stuck in a massive clean-up job. Now bear in mind that conversation took place in 1946. The first race was 1948, so it actually took them 2 years to get the whole thing kind of sorted out. And it was amazing the way that the history works out, because 18th of September 1948 was the very first race there, and the revival eventually took place on the 18th of September 1998. So to the day the revival started 50 years after the very first race meeting at Goodwood. So this again is the first race meeting. Hopefully you can see all of that quite clearly. And the layout hasn't changed. So where these cars are all lined up, luckily they got a nice dry day for it actually, everybody out in the open there. But all along there where those cars are, that would be where the white pit building is now. And you can see here the little link road leading back into the paddock. The chicane would be down here. That would become the Super Shell building. And the control tower is just out of shot here on the right hand side. So the basic structure and layout is unchanged. So that meeting was a success, and they went on obviously then to have more and more races. Initially it was just a one-day meeting, but obviously then it grew. That looks like a lot of fun. Obviously crash helmets were optional in those days. In the post-war era, I guess people had sort of slightly different perceptions of danger, if you like. Some parts of the track got faster and faster, and then in 1952 they decided to build a chicane. Now, I don't know whose genius idea it was to build a brick wall right in the middle of a race circuit, but that is what they actually did. Unbelievably, the chicane was built out of bricks. That was bricks there as well. And I mean, it was potentially carnage. I mean, you hit that and you broke bones. People literally did. I think that's Jean Berra there who did actually break bones in that accident. Yeah, so not exactly the best material for a chicane. This photograph, I think 1962, obviously as well as single seaters, there's a lot of sports car racing went on there, and this is what became known as the Le Mans start. So the drivers would start from one side of the track, run across, jump into their cars, and off they would go. That was banned by the RAC in 1962, so that was the last ever Le Mans start, or was it? I'll come back to that later on. When people think of the revival and think of Goodwood today, they think it has, you know, as the name suggests, it's revived what went before. But I mean, you can't see it terribly clearly, but if you look at all of that there, present day Goodwood is way nicer than it was in period. I mean, it was just, you know, loaded like wooden garages, and you know, it was a bit rough around the edges. In honesty, back in period, what we've got today is at a way higher standard than it was actually originally. So fascinating photograph in the Goodwood pit lane here. Standing watching, we've got Bruce McLaren, who obviously started the McLaren Formula 1 team. In the car, we've got Jackie Stewart, who started the Stewart Formula 1 team, which became Jaguar, which became Red Bull. Over here, we've got Ken Tyrrell. His team became BAR, became Honda, became Braun, became Mercedes. So the DNA of the teams that those three guys started, Mercedes, McLaren, and Red Bull. Isn't that amazing? Those three guys started those three teams, still going to this day. And on the right hand side, another legend of the sport, John Cooper. Obviously his name lives on in Cooper, Mini Coopers and so forth. So quite a story of how Jackie Stewart came to be there, but essentially he was extremely fast, extremely capable, went straight into Formula 3 with Ken Tyrrell, won the championship, and that propelled him straight into Formula 1 the next year. So here he is back at Goodwood just a year later, racing a BRN in Formula 1 with one single season of single-seater racing behind him. He was a Grand Prix driver, which is pretty incredible by any standards. I think that even beats Max Verstappen. So this is a speed table. So you see here on that day when that photograph was taken, actually 1965, the lap record was actually shared between the two great Scottish drivers, Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart. 1 minute 20.4 seconds, as you can see now. You might think that I've got that photograph there out of some kind of archive, but actually I didn't. That was in the programme when I raced at Goodwood in 2012. So all the way through the early years of the revival, the old lap record was not broken. Eventually then in, I think some years after that, it was actually eventually broken. I think in 2015 it was broken by a Can-Am car, which I was a bit sad about because I kind of liked the idea that the old Jackie Stewart lap record still was the lap record at Goodwood for all those years. So Freddie was getting older by then, safety was getting more and more important, and the whole hassle of running the infrastructure, etc., just became a bit too much for him. So in 1966 he closed the circuit for racing. So that is why to this day the revival is for cars between 1948 and 1966. They were the years during which Goodwood was originally active. So it became a testing venue. Of course, testing carried on. Remember what I was saying, how the garages and everything today are much nicer than what they actually were in period. You can see just little scaffolding poles and tin sheets of tin. So it's nothing like what it actually is to this day. So this was probably the most tragic day at Goodwood. This is Bruce McLaren here, and driving a car similar to that, a Can-Am car. Bodywork came off in the back straight and crashed. Unfortunately, was killed. So that was back in 1970. Now, you all know about, when you're watching modern Formula One, about data acquisition and all these guys sitting with banks of computers and all the readouts and all the rest of it to how the car is actually performing. Back in the day, data acquisition was a little bit more sort of basic. So you've actually got a tyre technician that's sitting in the back of the car, going around, watching how the tyre is actually performing real. But I mean, it was perfectly safe. He had a crash helmet on, so I mean, it wasn't. So not all about the cars, of course. The Queen and her family would come down to Goodwood, and this is Freddie with the Queen. What age is she there? I don't know, what, 40 maybe, something like that. Probably in the late 50s or in the 60s, and they would come down. Freddie would entertain the Queen at the horse racing. Now, tradition within the family that when the heir gets to around about the age of 40, he will take over the running of the estate. And around about 1993, the man that we knew at that time as Lord March was the heir apparent, and his idea, 60 years after his grandfather had done it, was to revive this idea of a hill climb up past the house. So this is a photograph that I actually took in 1993. I was here at the very first Festival of Speed, and none of us really knew what to expect, including Lord March as he then was. As you can see, it was all a bit basic back then, just a few straw bales here and there, and we got on with doing the hill climb up there. But it was successful from day one. I mean, you can see here, there's obviously a Williams here and a Ferrari behind there, and an Arrows, I think that is. So, I mean, from day one it was a big hit, and obviously from that point on it grew and grew. One of my heroes, everybody's heroes really, Sterling Moss at the revival a few years later, driving the Ferguson Formula One car. Whole big story behind that. That's the only four-wheel drive Formula One car ever to have won a race. Didn't win a Grand Prix, won a non-championship race, but fascinating car, and good to see Sir Sterling reunited with it. Now, with the success of the Festival of Speed, momentum started to build towards bringing racing back to the circuit, which of course, as we know, had been dormant since 1966. There was an organisation started called the Goodwood Supporters Association, and I was a member of that in the early days, and we were lobbying with local councils and all the rest of it. Again, it's a big story of how all of that process took place. What was the Goodwood Supporters Association eventually became the GRRC that we know today. And we were lobbying and making suggestions that we should try to bring racing back to Goodwood. I then became an instructor at the circuit, so I've driven hundreds of laps around there doing dealer days and also instructing individuals who wanted to start racing. We did some dealer days for Ferrari. Again, this is a picture that I took in the Goodwood paddock in the mid-1990s. Now, bear in mind, the revival started in 1998. This is what they started off with, just like rough grass, like those old tin sheds that you saw earlier on as the pits. So there was a vast investment made in infrastructure in a very short space of time to bring the standard up that we know today at the revival. Everybody know about that? The photographs of it aren't very good. It all happened so quickly that none of the professionals really got a shot of it. That's two private people took this picture of Ray Hanna to mark the opening of the circuit in 1998. Flew his Spitfire at what's technically known as 0 feet. Doesn't mean literally zero, but you know, next thing to it. And I know a guy who was up in the control tower. He was looking down into the cockpit of the Spitfire as he flew along the main pit straight. Everybody was very impressed. Apart from the CAA, and poor old Ray did lose his license actually for a little while for doing that. There's a fantastic painting of it. So there's no really good photographs of it. But there is a fantastic painting of it that you can buy. So obviously the revival went on from strength to strength. I raced there in 2012 in my Sunbeam Rapier here. I'd always admired an Irish driver called Derek Daly. He was retired and living in America. It's a whole story in itself. I hadn't raced for 20 years. I got onto the phone, persuaded him to renew his license, and after a 20-year gap he did renew his license, flew over here, raced with me at the revival, and it was just absolutely fantastic. I mentioned earlier on that the Le Mans type start was banned in 1962, but top marks for whoever had this idea. Because in the Setterton Cup for the kids, and the pedal cars, they actually revived the whole idea of the Le Mans start, so that the kids all run across, jump into the little pedal cars. Obviously it's a little bit safer to do it that way, and off they go down the straight for a little pretend race. So I think that's a genius idea, whoever thought that one up. So as we saw earlier on, in the old days the cars were wrecked by the chicane, but these days the cars wreck the chicane. It's all the way around now, which obviously nowadays, rather than being built of brick, is made of polystyrene, fake bricks, which I think is the better way around. That's a little bit fuzzy. I think it's a still from a video, that actually, rather than being a photograph. So I ticked another box in 2017 when I did the Festival of Speed up on the rally stage. Any of you haven't been up on the rally stage, absolutely fantastic to go up there. I think, Sophie, you're working up there tomorrow, yeah? So really brilliant. And this was the fastest car I've ever driven, R5 rally car from Malcolm Wilson, M Sport World Championship car. Absolute flipping rocket machine. So a quick bit of Goodwood trivia. Who can tell me what's the fastest car that's ever been to Goodwood, or driven around the Goodwood circuit, I should say, to be more precise? What's the fastest car that's ever driven around Goodwood? No, I'm being a little cryptic here. I didn't say what car holds the lap record. I said, what's the fastest car? No. People quite often get this. Bluebird. Donald Campbell brought Bluebird down to Goodwood and did a few laps. Bearing in mind it's only got 4 degrees of steering lock. He wasn't pushing it too hard on the corners. But it is technically the fastest car that has ever been here. Obviously you recognise the little control tower that I mentioned earlier on in the background there. I always find this interesting. On the left we've got a wartime photograph, aerial photograph of Goodwood, and then on the right hand side from our friend Mr. Google, the present day. And as you can see, the circuit is absolutely unchanged, which is kind of unique. You think of something like Silverstone, for example, it was a bomber base, but it's completely unrecognisable as to how it was actually during the war. But Goodwood has very strongly retained its originality, and that precise shape is still there. And so, as we know, this was just the perimeter road, as we said earlier on, around the airfield. So nobody ever designed that in any way. That's just simply the shape that evolved. And then the chicane, as we know, was put into that location. So, Goodwood Estate today, 12,000 acres. We obviously know the motor circuit, Goodwood House, Goodwood Racecourse, organic farm that we mentioned, 2 golf courses, the aerodrome and the flying school, clay shooting, 91 bedroom hotel, health and fitness, kennels, farmer butcher chef restaurant, the Hound Lodge, Rolls-Royce motor cars, of course, was built on the estate as well. Employs over 550 people, including Sophie, and attracts about 800,000 visitors to the estate each year. So an amazing operation. As I said earlier on, it is England's premier sporting estate. So just going to finish with this photograph. If you're interested in Goodwood, you also are likely to be interested in Brooklands. Lots of connections between the 2 circuits. As we said, the present Duke's grandfather actually raced there just before the Second World War. Parts of Brooklands are still there. A fantastic museum. Anybody wants to come along and look at some of the history of Brooklands. Jim and Angela here come along to some of our talks programs. So we've various Grand Prix drivers, and we've had Karun Chandra, Derek Warwick, you name it, coming along. So yeah, I would encourage anybody to come along to the talks program at Brooklands. Okay, so that's about it, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody got any questions about Goodwood that they'd like to ask me?
What's the current attendance now? What's it grown? What was it in 1993 and what's it grown to now?
Yeah, in 1993, I think it was less than 10,000 actually. Yeah, and it was my son was at it. He's exactly the same age as the Festival of Speed because he was like a babe in arms. Always measure up by him. But but like I said, it was successful really from day one, and certainly in terms of the participants that came here. So it grew pretty quickly actually. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other?
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, that's
the oracle.
That's the 25-minute version of an hour talk actually. So there is more. Yeah, there is more.
That's great. Well, we're going to do a bit of Q&A with Harry as well. So before that, thank you very much, Harry.
Thank you.
We've heard about Goodwood, we've heard about Brooklands, but let's talk about you. Where did this love of motorsport and Goodwood come from?
Well, really going back to my school days, really just got interested in cars and from there motor racing, and then obviously moved to this part of the world, and I've been going to Goodwood since 1988. So I started motor racing, and we did our initial testing down there in the late 80s. So during that period that I described in the talk, when it wasn't an active race circuit, but it was available for testing.
Yeah. And you talked about 2012 with the Goodwood Revival. I mean, that's a fantastic weekend. What's that like to race against? I mean, some premier drivers as well. And how did you do?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of the story that I don't tell, which people sometimes ask me about, because as you probably know, the Goodwood Revival is invitation only. And what I don't tell is, how do you get an invitation?
Right.
That just sort of that just sits behind the scenes, how you get invited. But anyway, I managed to get myself invited, and yeah, we had a terrific time. We came 12th in the end. It's a sort of a pro-am race. There was two different races, and the results are amalgamated. So out of a field of 30, we were pretty happy with that. We thought that wasn't bad for our first year.
Yeah, and obviously, as you say, you did the rally stage, but you left a bit of an impression on Goodwood, didn't you?
Oh well, thanks for bringing that up, Nick. Yeah, I did crash into one of the Duke's trees, unfortunately. And I don't think the tree was much the worse for wear. It was the car I was more worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. But at least it's a lovely memory of Goodwood. Let's talk about Brooklands. You mentioned your talks. You've had some fascinating people over the last couple of years, haven't you?
Yeah. We had Tiffany Dell, and probably one of our favourites was Vicky Butler Henderson. She was absolutely fantastic. What a lovely person. Were you two that one? You Vicky? No, you missed that one. Yeah, she was great. Yeah. And we had Karun Chandhook as well. His partner in crime, Crofty, David Croft, is coming in February.
Oh, fantastic!
So it's going to slot him in when there's not a Formula 1 race.
Definitely be at that one, definitely. And outside of being a motorsport historian, you're also a employment law solicitor.
Yep, I am. This is our little my day job is advising companies on how to handle staff issues, shall I say.
Any crossover? We're motorsport to business. Any crossovers that you take from motorsport and put into your day-to-day work?
Well, I think attention to detail, something I pick out of, I see the incredible attention to detail of motorsport engineers. I look at people who are handling different situations, different contexts, but if they can bring that sort of skill or that application of attention to detail, I think it pays a lot of dividends in all sorts of fields in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, more recently, you've been over to Ukraine as well, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm involved in a charity that delivers humanitarian aid to Ukraine, so we went out in a convoy with various 4x4s and things. I had a jeep absolutely packed to the roof with stretchers and bandages and body wipes, all kinds of humanitarian stuff. Drove across Germany, Poland into Ukraine, because as soon as you cross Ukraine, all your insurance is invalid because you're now in a war zone and you're now against government advice actually going there. So it was a little bit hairy, but we duly delivered all the aid to the Ukrainian army, stayed 2 nights in western Ukraine, and then flew back home from Poland.
That must be quite a humbling experience, maybe is the right way to put it.
It was, yeah, and we went to a new military graveyard, and there's the bodies of 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers in there, young chaps, all with their pictures up on the gravestone and everything. That was very moving.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, no, and but as I say, thank you so much for joining us today. Each talk you give is so fascinating, and as I say, I've been coming here since 1997, and I was at the first revival back in 1998, and as I say, it's always good to know more. It's always good to learn more about what we're doing and how it became, because it's a fascinating history. This, as you say, with a few illegitimate children along the way, it's a fascinating history of Goodwood. So no, thanks so much, Harry. Really appreciate you joining us again this year. And no, thanks very much.
Thanks everybody. Thank you.
Right. And no, thanks again to Harry. And that's not it for today, for our Speaker Saturday. We have Jim Wiseman joining us at 3 o'clock, talking around his time working as a producer of Top Gear and his recent documentary of Mansell Red 5. So please join us for that as well. But thank you, Harry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.